Hello and welcome back to Logan Sounds Off. Today on my podcast, I'm going to be doing an interview with not only a musician, he co-founded a record label, he has an audio book, and he's done so much for the music community as of late, especially with the collection of his father works of Ivor Raymond, along with much more, which we're going to get into. Today I'm going to be talking to Simon Raymonde of Bella Union, Cocteau Twins, and much more. Simon, how are you doing today?
Hey Logan, how's it going, man? It's a very pleasure to talk to you. Everything is good. The sun is shining for the first time in a long, long while down here in Brighton, where I live. So all is good with the world.
That's good to hear. And it was very sunny today, over in cloudy Ireland today as well. So it's brilliant to hear that. Before we get into our chat, I'd just like to ask you just to introduce yourself to people who may not be familiar with you. For those who don't know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, indeed. So, as you correctly said at the beginning, my name's Simon Raymonde. I've been doing this music game for, wow, blimey. Well, I'm 62 now, so I guess I started when I was about 15. So, mathematicians amongst you, work it out for yourself. It's pretty much a whole lifetime of music things. And yeah, you know what? I guess over the last 4 or 5 decades, I've pretty much done everything there is to do. I mean, there's always things I want to look to do in the future, but I started out as a musician, signed to an independent record label, in my early 20s. Um, Joined a band that was becoming successful, went on to become very successful in the Cocteau Twins, in the sort of heyday of the 80s and early 90s, when people actually used to buy records and CDs, and you could actually make a living from music if you're a musician. Any young musicians watching, yes, that really did exist once upon a time. You could make a living from this game. Um, so yeah, I was in the band until we broke up in 1997, and we started a record label just prior to the breakup. Um, because I think we'd had miserable experiences on our record labels, so we thought we'd start our own. Um, a lot of that is covered in the book, and I'm sure you're going to ask me some questions about that. So those are my two kind of main careers, I suppose you'd say, as a musician first, and now for the last 28 years, good Lord, is it that long? I've been running the label Bella Union, so signing and discovering bands from wherever. I base my taste on nothing more than gut instinct, and whether I love it, and love the people. I'm not looking for sales particularly, or to catch the next big thing or anything like that. I just really go by what I love, because I figure that's the only thing I can actually honestly know. All the rest is just guesswork. Um, so yeah, I'm a very lucky boy. I have probably the greatest job in the world, I would suggest.
It's a fantastic place to be, especially when Bella Union is such a fantastic record label. And if you're
Oh,
curious to
thanks.
learn more about Bella Union, links to their website, social media, and much more will be linked in the episode description. So, starting off from your youth, from listening to your autobiography in one ear, as you mentioned earlier, I know that you grew up in a very musical house, and your father, Ivor, was a famous musician, songwriter, arranger, and actor. Could you tell us a little bit more about the music that was being played in your house when you were young? Just in those kind of formative years when you were 6 to 8, what were you hearing?
Yeah, so that's the sort of time of the heyday, the pop explosion in the UK, I guess. After what happened with my dad was he started off in the 50s, really, playing music on the Queen Mary, going from Southampton to New York, playing in a little jazz band, and then he started to get into arranging and putting bands together for artists, and putting records together for artists when he got back home from the ship. And one thing led to another, as things always do in this business. You meet someone else. Then he started getting into doing orchestrations and producing, and Yeah, as you suggested there, he started working with some incredible people like Dusty Springfield, like the Walker Brothers. So of course, those kind of records, the pop records of the late '60s and early '70s, would have been the stuff that I heard in the house, right? So I've got all my brothers and sisters, one brother and two half sisters who are all older than me. So I'm still the baby in the house, so I'm not really that into music. Other than I'm aware that it's happening. I love the Beach Boys, Good Vibrations, things like that with incredible harmonies. Obviously I like the Stones and the Beatles and things like that. But I wasn't. I was more into football, if I'm honest. Like when I was a kid, I think because there was music just being talked about non-stop in the house. I guess as a child, sometimes you sort of want to do the thing that that no one else is doing. You don't want to just follow like everyone else. And my sisters and brother were all totally into music. I was more interested in going out and outside in the garden and playing with my friends, playing kicking a ball about. But it wasn't really until I was quite a bit older um, that I started to appreciate music. I was sort of I was at a boarding school from quite young, and because of my dad's prowess as a musician, I guess it was sort of, I don't know, maybe obvious that they would push an instrument on me a bit early, and I got landed with the violin when I was probably about 6 or 7, and I really hated it, Logan. I just didn't get on with it at all. But because I was at school, the son of this very famous musician, it was like that's that guy. His dad's famous. So I sort of had to be good. I had to practice and I had to, live up to the family expectation, I suppose. Until that point where I was like, you know what? I hate this. I don't even know why I'm doing it. And it sort of broke me a little bit, the violin playing, because I was staring out the window one day while I was screeching away on this violin in this woman's class, and I was just staring out the window watching all my friends play football. And I came out of the lesson and I just called my mum and dad and I just said, sorry, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm giving up the violin. So of course they were naturally horrified. But just round the corner was another adventure, and learning the bass was what came next. So that was probably about age 14, 15, I think. Um, and that's sort of what led to me doing what I'm doing now, I guess.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. And then were you saying you were learning to play the bass, and obviously you clearly weren't very passionate about the violin, but you were passionate about the bass because in 1980 you started playing music with your first group, the Drowning Craze.
Mhm.
What was it that inspired you to start a band?
Oh well, most definitely. The punk rock was this catalyst to everything really in my life that I'm doing now. That I started with back in the sort of late '70s. So I'd be 14 when I heard the Sex Pistols, and that was really, my entry point. My brother just given me a bass guitar that he'd gotten off someone in the Vibrators called Pat Collier, and he gave me this bass guitar and I went up to my bedroom and I just bought Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, and I basically plugged my bass into the hi-fi system and just started playing along with the album and found it really easy, fairly easy, and learnt the whole record in like a day. So I was like, oh. This is brilliant. I'm going to be a bass player. So it sort of was decided very early for me by that record that that was what I could do. So I started looking for friends at school that would be interested in joining a band with me because at this time, 1976, 1977, like punk was so much more than just a little thing that was happening. It was just massive for kids that were into it. It really was life changing because it wasn't really just the music, Logan. It was just everything. It was like the political side, the social side, going to gigs, The Rock Against Racism, the whole thing that was going on in London. Because remember, this is Thatcherism, is rife at this point. Margaret Thatcher's in power as the Prime Minister, and everybody hates her. There's strikes going on. The whole country's in a total mess. Yet on the flip side, there's a bit of a revolution going on in music, because this thing has come along out of nowhere that is sort of firing the spirits and hearts of teenagers like me, and it's what give us a reason for living, to be honest. And um, that's what got me started. So the Drowning Craze kind of came out of that first school band. Wasn't quite the same personnel. One or two people in the original school band, ended up being in the final Drowning Craze band, but it was quite short-lived. We did a couple of singles or maybe even three. Yes, we did three singles with a small little label that was affiliated with 4AD, who of course I then went on to work with Cocteau Twins. So it led to everything. That job, that first release with the Drowning Craze, led to me getting a job. Well, it was actually the job that led me to getting in the Cocteau Twins. Sorry, the Drowning Craze a deal, because I worked in Beggar's Banquet record shop at the age of 18, which was one of the most influential independent record shops in London at the time. As influential as Rough Trade probably would be now. Well, and was then. It was one of the other ones. So Beggar's Banquet was a shop in South Kensington, and literally above the record shop where I worked were all the labels. So 4AD, Beggar's Banquet, Situation 2, who my band was signed to, and other bands like the Associates and Gina Loves Jezebel, and I think the Cult were signed to Beggars, if I'm not mistaken, Bauhaus. Um, so it was, a really thriving little scene. And I'm only at this point, I'm only 18 years old, 19 years old. So, for me, it's just like I'm wide-eyed and just like, wow, this is just the greatest life of all. And of course, I'm doing that during the day, working at the shop during the day, and then I'm playing gigs and going to gigs every single night of the week. And you have to think that this period is one of the most fertile periods in music in terms of creativity and a real genuine movement in music that you probably, maybe some people will say the Britpop thing was one, or the rave culture was one. But for me, certainly, I can't speak for other people. I can only say for me, the punk explosion, and actually the post-punk thing, because the punk was all right, but it was what got us all started, but it burnt out very quick. You know what I mean? The music was good, but it was exciting for 5 minutes, but then after a while it just became a bit boring. It was just the same three chords, and then the high street chains got a hold of punk and commercialized it and just ruined everything, like all good things. Um, as soon as it appears on the high street, it's over. Um, but yeah, that's how I got into it, man, and it stays with me to this day. It's like that spirit really hasn't left.
That's really, really cool. And I love just hearing about that spirit of, and as you were saying, there are a lot of punk was commercialized and that kind of punk scene because it became quite famous. But it's great to see that punk still lives on in spirit, which is really, really interesting. And just for the listener, a quick note, if you do want to hear any of the Drowning Crazes music, link to buying any of the Drowning Crazes music will be linked down below on Bella Union's website. And you mentioned there that when you were 18, you worked in the Beggar's Banquet shop, and which was below the offices of those multiple record labels, including 4AD. And that's where you kind of got on the journey, which led to you joining Cocteau Twins in 1983 after meeting Robin Guthrie. Could you tell us a bit more about that day and what happened that got you started on your journey with Cocteau Twins?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's I don't remember it like it's yesterday, because it clearly isn't. It's 1983. It's like a lifetime ago. But in a sense, having written the book and gone back into all my memory banks and sort of gone through this whole history, it does feel a bit like it only just happened, even though it almost feels like it's someone else's life because it is so long ago. So in the shop, it's a beautiful little record shop, literally tiny, this very small shop. Maybe you could fit 50 people in there at a push. So me and Steve Kent, who was the boss of the shop, ironically, not ironically, but interestingly, his brother Peter was the guy that ran um, Situation 2, the record label that my own little band signed to, that was in one of the upstairs offices. So we would get in usually most mornings around, I don't know, 9:30, have a cup of coffee, open up the boxes of records that would have just been delivered, with all the latest 7-inch singles in and stuff, and albums and whatnot. And we'd start unpacking them and putting them on the shelves. And then usually around about 10:30, 11 o'clock, the record company people would arrive. Um, Now, they had to walk through the shop, right, to get to their offices upstairs. There wasn't like a separate entrance for their office. It was all sort of, you walk through the shop and then they went out the back and up to the offices above. So there was a knock on the door around about 9:30, which was unusual. If it wasn't a delivery, we wouldn't normally have got visitors at that time in the day because we didn't open ourselves as a shop until 10. So there's a knock on the window. I go over to see who it is, and I'm pretty sure the three of them were there. So that would have been Robin Elizabeth and Will Heggie, the original bass player. Um, I've read somewhere that it was two, just Robin and Liz, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been because it was 1982, uh, and the first record hadn't even come out yet, or maybe it was 1981. The first record, hadn't come out yet, and they were delivering this debut album to 4AD, the label they either just signed to or wanted to be signed to. That bit I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But they knocked on the door. I went over and said, "Hi, can I help you?" And they basically said, "We're here to see Ivo Watts Russell, who was the boss of 4AD Records. And we've got a tape for him, which turned out to be their debut album. And we just wondered if we could give it to him." So I said, "Well, look, he ain't in at the minute, but he'll be in probably in about an hour if you want to come back." And I can't remember what happened, but I don't think they were able to come back because they had to catch a bus home or something. So I said, "Well, I'm happy to deliver the tape for him," and they were like, "Oh, great, thank you." Handed the tape over. I get on with my day. They go back to their lives, and that's sort of just a nice little thing that was forgotten about because it didn't really have any significance for me at that moment for obvious reasons because the band hadn't put a record out yet, and I didn't really know them from Adam. They didn't know who I was. Well, they didn't. Yeah, so it was just a chance meeting, right? And maybe only later, when the things happened that happened, did it become like, oh my gosh, that's totally bizarre. So a couple of years later, the band are now no longer a three-piece. They're a two-piece. Robin and Elizabeth, who were also a couple, they put out their first record on 4AD, which of course, become pretty well known, playing 500 or 600 people in London, starting to tour all around the UK. I'm already doing my band, Drowning Craze, who it turned out they were a fan of because in those days, these little scenes, everyone knew everyone else's thing, even though the scene to everyone else seemed massive, actually wasn't. It was pretty small. So I bumped into them several times over the next couple of years at shows, through going up to see them on tour with the record company guys. Uh, so we just started becoming gentle friends, and didn't really think anything more of it than that until by chance I ended up in a little recording studio with them where I had a Saturday job. I'd invited them to come and use the studio because I knew they were looking for a place to just mess about. And they came over and, well, we had a really lovely time. I mean, I think they thought I was asking them to come and record at my studio, which is really not what was going on in my mind. I knew I had the keys to this place because the owners had gone away, and I worked there on a Saturday. And I said, "Look, you guys may as well use this place because it's just going to sit empty for the weekend." Come and use it. So they turned up and said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I don't want to do anything. I'll make you a cup of tea and you can crack on. And what happened was, why I don't really know why, but just because it just felt like an opportunity too good to miss out on, we wrote a song together. Well, me and Robin wrote a piece of music together, like really, really, really quickly, just out of nowhere. I don't know where it came from or how it happened. Very bizarre because I'd never written music with anyone else other than my own friends in my own band. So to sort of sit in a room with a relative stranger and within an hour or so, maybe less, come up with this piece of music that was really amazing and which Elizabeth reacted to incredibly positively, said it was just one of the most gorgeous things she'd heard. I went back home that night thinking, wow, that was a hell of a great day. How cool. And I went back to my job. I'd now moved to a different record shop because the Beggars Banquet shop had sadly closed down. And I can't remember how long it was, but maybe a week or two or a month later, I got a phone call just as I was heading off to work one day. Actually, no, I got a phone call the day after I'd just been fired, or not fired, but demoted from manager to assistant manager for making an absolute cock up with something at work. I got a phone call from Robin saying, "Hello, we really loved recording with you, uh, the other day in Camden, and wondered if you fancy coming and joining the band and writing some stuff with us and coming up to Scotland and making our next record with us." And I was like, "Oh, I mean, yeah, that would be amazing." And that's what happened. I think it was like November 1983, I think, when I got the call. And that's it, man. 14 years later, we broke up, but in between, we had some grand old times and some terrible ones as well. But that's for every band to say.
That's it's a really, really interesting and quite some but it's just a lovely story though, starting off from just going from a simple tape to having a new bass player. It's really, really cool. And then I heard that you began playing with the Cocteau Twins for a while before the recording of Treasure. So when it came to the recording of Treasure, coming in, sitting down, starting to record an album, was it just the same as playing live as nerves wise? Were you just going, okay, well, I'm just playing with the same group? Or were you more anxious to get into the studio to start recording something?
Well, the more I look back on it, the more I realize that, the whole history of the band and the way the three of us wrote music together, um, is bizarre. It is unusual. It's not normal. It's not how other bands work. At the time, I didn't really know that because it was kind of it was my first proper band anyway. My other band was just sort of a part-time thing that was just done for fun. I had no idea what being in a band really was like, a proper band who were, supposed to be making albums. So the record company would sort of say, "Well, we'll book some studio time when you're ready. As soon as you're ready to go in and make your first record or your second record, let us know." And we hadn't even written well. We'd done an EP actually. We'd done the Pearly Dewdrops EP. I think we did that first. Um, so we had written a few songs together and it had been great fun, but then to go and record an album together, that's a whole nother game. It's 10 songs, you're in there for a few weeks. But in those days it was a residential studio where you basically lived in the place, you lived in the house where you made the record. So we went to this place in a place called Strayton in Scotland, in between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and we were just in this house, and the owner had a kind of studio in the on the ground floor, and I just sort of arrived, had no idea what to expect. Robin said, "Oh, I've told the label that we've got the album ready," and I was like, "Oh." Well, we haven't written a song yet. And he was like, "Yeah, I know, but don't worry about it. It'll all be good. We'll just make it up as we go along." So I think his sort of confidence in us just winging it was probably what made me relax and just think, oh, well, if he says it's going to be all right, it'll be all right, I'm sure. But then I think when we actually got into the studio on the first day, I was like, how are we going to do this? We haven't got anything written in advance. What are we supposed to do? Just press play and record and just make it up as we go along? And actually, that is exactly what we did. And then pretty much that's exactly what we did for the next 14 years. And it just sounds so mysterious, doesn't it, when you sort of explain it in so simple a term? What really? You just turned the tape machine on and you just plugged your instruments on, and then the songs just sort of what came out of nowhere. I'm loath to say, well, yes, that was what happened, but basically it is. Of course, there's other things that go on at the same time. There's the utilization of effects pedals and guitars and using the outboard gear in the studio to influence the sound that that was in your head that you were trying to make that would inspire you to create a song, because that's really how the band works. It wasn't so much just plugging a guitar in and just winging it. It was plugging a guitar or your bass or whatever into a piece of equipment that would change the sound of your guitar so that it made you go, ooh, that's cool. And then you start playing it, and then all of a sudden the notes just sort of happen. And when you're both doing that together and you're playing along with a drum machine or, a rhythm that you've just created just literally out of nowhere, stuff happens. And maybe it was because that the chemistry between us was great. I don't know. I can only say what it felt like to me. And, these songs did sort of write themselves. Obviously, we got better at it over the years. Maybe the first record was a bit ropey. We always said publicly that Treasure was terrible. Because I think listening back to it, we felt, oh, we didn't really know what we were doing. We were just winging it so bad, and we didn't have the time to finish it properly. But we said we'd deliver it on this date, and we had a tour book, so we kind of just delivered it. And to me, it sort of felt a bit like half finished. Um, but people seem to love it so much that I think I've sort of I think we all sort of stopped saying hate it. We hate it because I don't think any fan wants to hear that the people who made the record hated it, because didn't, it's not a good look, is it? So I think after a while I was like, what we think about it, or what we thought about it at the time, is really not very important. Is what other people think about it that matters. And if they all love it, then wonderful. So I think with maturity and the years pass, you sort of understand that these records have a life of their own. But certainly going in for the next album and the one after that, you use your experiences from the first record, or take those moments where you thought, oh, I didn't think that was quite right how we did that, and you adapt it and adopt it and you change it and you fiddle around with it. And like anything you do every day of your life, you're if you're half decent, you're going to get better at it. If a footballer plays football every day to get better, and I think as a musician that's definitely true. The more you do something, the better you get at it, the more experience, and the more you look to what you do as a means to an end. We were definitely trying to make better records each time we went into the studio. We weren't always sure we were doing it, but I think when we get to 1990 and we are making Heaven Las Vegas, which is a good 5 years after Treasure. Oh, sorry, no, a good 6 or 7 years after Treasure. Um, we're of course better at everything by then, and I think, well, sonically, it is probably the best record we made, and I think Robin was absolutely on fire at this point as a sort of mixer and a programmer of drums, and the sounds he was getting on his guitars, and I think the work that he was doing in particular on Having Las Vegas was pretty extraordinary. And uh, we can talk about Elizabeth later, but certainly his work on that record was very special indeed.
Wow, that's really, really cool. And Treasure, by the way, anybody who's listening and they want to listen to Treasure or any of the Cocteau Twins albums, the links will be down below. Um, and also, though, this is a really interesting time for you because you weren't just playing with Cocteau Twins. You also performed with This Mortal Coil in 1983. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got started playing with This Mortal Coil?
Yeah, you know what though? It should be noted that the This Mortal Coil releases, it was very much not. It's very much a recording project. It's not a band, right? So the boss of the record label, Ivo Watts Russell, so he's a non-musician, and I think maybe the idea of This Mortal Coil came to him because he wanted to put all his connections together, people that he was working with, people that he wasn't yet working with, and go into a studio with a producer and put something together, and his idea was to put it out under the name This Mortal Coil. So that's really what This Mortal Coil was. It wasn't really a band. Well, it definitely wasn't a band. It was just a producer who was working in a studio environment only. These songs never ever got played live. Well, Song to the Siren obviously later got played by us live once or twice, but um, This Mortal Coil was just a sort of studio project that I got asked to be part of. Well, many of us did. Many people in the 4AD family got asked to be part of the Small Core project, and because I don't know, I was okay at a few different instruments. I think Ivo asked me to help him probably a bit more than he'd asked some other people because I could play a few different things. So I really sort of threw myself into it. The first couple of records anyway. I didn't do any more than that. It took me away from the band at one point. I think on the second record, Filigree and Shadow. Um, I think Robin and Liz probably were like, uh, because I said, "Oh, I've been asked to do some more stuff for this Mortal Kombat," and they were like, "Okay, cool." But I think they were a bit impatient to get on with some recordings themselves, so they went off and made some music, which was probably never intended to be um, a Cocteau Twins release, but what they did was so good it actually was, and it came out as Victoria Land. Um, so obviously, when that happened, I thought, I'm in the Cocteau Twins. I need to stop doing all this other stuff. So that was sort of my last record. Filigree and Shadow was my last record working with this Mortal Coil. But I suppose looking back on it, I'm certainly proud of the bits that I did. Um, was it the greatest thing I ever did? No, it wasn't. But I'm certainly happy with my bits.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting to see though you going from playing with Cocteau Twins to playing with a bit with this Mortal Coil and Cocteau Twins, and now coming back to Cocteau Twins, you are coming to a really, really interesting point where the next album after Treasure that you recorded with Cocteau Twins was called The Moon and the Melodies, which was a collaboration between Cocteau Twins and Harold Budd, which took I believe 2 weeks to write and I believe came about through a television show that never was released.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about how that came about and what it was like collaborating with Harold?
Yeah, it just again, like a lot of these things, they just come out of nowhere. You're sitting around working out what you're going to do next, and then I think an email had come into, or a letter had come to. It wasn't an email at that point. A letter had arrived at the 4AD offices to Ivo Watts Russell, the boss, and asked him if he knew any artists that would be interested in participating in a Channel 4 TV show that was going to put artists from different genres of music together in a sort of experiment, like have them mess about in the studio together and see if they could, write a song or write some songs together. Um, and he asked us if we'd be interested in doing it, and we couldn't really think of anybody we wanted to do it with because we were weird at that time. We were like, don't really like anyone. Um, and he suggested, I think he suggested a few people, but he suggested Harold Budd, who I heard of through working in the record shop and stuff. I can't remember if I knew his stuff intimately, but I knew he'd worked with Brian Eno. So we had a listen, and I think his style of piano playing wasn't a million miles away from the kind of thing I was doing already, and I was doing in this Mortal Coil actually. So yeah, you know what? Let's do it. And we spoke to him on the phone, and he seemed like such a lovely chap based in California, and he was quite a bit older than us. But we said, yeah, you know what? Let's do it. We've got our own studio now. which was in North London. And once you come over, hang out with us for a few weeks, and we'll just potter around in the studio and see if anything comes out of it. And the plan was for you to come over, the film company would arrive, and they'd start filming, and blah, 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 blah. But then I think a week or 2 weeks before he was about to arrive, apparently the production company went bust or something, and the TV show got shelved. But he'd already bought his flight, and we were already kind of half looking forward to him coming over. So we just said, "Come over, and well, maybe we'll do something. Maybe we won't. We'll just hang out at least, and go to the pub and at least hang out for a little bit." So he came over, and we went to the studio for a couple of days, and we just messed about, man. I mean, that's just sort of what we did anyway. We just went into the studio and started messing around. And if something cool happened, then we'd record it and keep it. And if it didn't, well, we'd go to the pub, or go bowling or something, or go and do something else. That's just how we worked anyway. So having someone else involved in it who was very laid back, super chill kind of guy, lovely to spend time with, it wasn't at all a difficult collaboration, even though maybe we weren't really sure what we were doing and if what we were doing was any good. We couldn't really tell, because a lot of this, 3 or 4 of the songs, if you listen to them now, they do sound like they could fit on our Cocteau Twins record quite happily. And then there's the other stuff which we didn't really know what we were going to do with. Maybe some of Harold's kind of noodlings, or we'd sort of maybe put a few other little parts on them, but they weren't really sort of turning into songs. They were more like just pieces of music. So I don't even think we believed this was an album as such. But we got to the end of it. His time was up. He needed to fly back to California. We were. I think we had a couple of weeks together in the studio, and then we just started mixing some of the tracks. And then Ivo listened to them and said, "Yeah, let's put this out." So we were like, "Well, it's not really a Cocteau Twins record, is it?" So the decision was made to call it. I mean, nowadays you'll go onto Spotify, or you go into a record shop, and it'll be in the Cocteau Twins section, and it'll just say Cocteau Twins and Harold Budd, because it's easier to say Cocteau Twins and Harold Budd than read out all our individual names, because that's a heck of a mouthful, isn't it? But that's how the record was titled in up until recently. I think it's only because Spotify, the advent of Spotify meant that people were trying to find this record and couldn't find it, so it just got plopped into the Cocteau Twins section, which is fine, because that's ultimately what it is, right? It is a Cocteau Twins and Harold Budd record, but for some reason I can't remember why it wasn't that, but it was just all our individual names. And the record came out, and it did fine. I think it even went to the charts. And we just got on with our lives, and carried on making music. And Harold went back to his and carried on making his. So it was a lovely experience, a bit of fun, nothing too dramatic, didn't take up any of our time, much of our time, and it was really good fun to do. Did we ever play any of the songs live? I can't remember. Maybe a couple of them we did, but certainly a really nice experience. And I always have very fond memories of working with Harold. Absolute diamond of a human being.
That's really, really cool. And last year in 2024, Cocteau Twins remastered The Moon and the Melodies.
Yeah.
How did you find returning to the album and giving it a new sound?
Well, you know what? I think, like with a lot of things from that era, they sort of get a new life in time. I think we've certainly seen it with Beach House on our record label, but I think in time, with the advent of TikTok, and people using music as a sort of, I don't know, soundtrack to personal events, heartache, or otherwise, uh, bits of music like that are quite cinematic do often sort of become quite viral. And we were finding with the Moon and the Melodies, there was a song on there called "Sea Swallow Me," um, that was going from, all our stuff streams quite well, but there was a track, "Sea Swallow Me," that was just streaming like crazy number. And I think when we told 4AD about it, they were like, well, maybe now would be a good time to repress the record again because it actually hadn't been repressed on vinyl since 19 whatever it was 86. So it was high time that that record was repressed and sort of reinvigorated a little bit because I think there's some really beautiful pieces on there. I mean, Harold had also, passed away sadly a couple of years back, so I thought it was a really great time to get that record back out there. And I'm really happy they did reissue it because it definitely stands up there.
That's really, really cool. And if you want to listen to The Moon and the Melodies, um, links will be down below to all of Cocteau Twins' work. And then during your journey with Cocteau Twins, you also recorded and later released in 2022 a studio album. So if you could kind of take us back to when you were making your own solo music, what was the process and the inspiration to start making your own music as a solo musician?
Gosh, I think at the this is the solo stuff. I think for me definitely came quite late. I think when I started making my own music was when we were in when we'd already made Heaven Las Vegas. The band was already starting to experience some sort of personal difficulties, and we were just we had this beautiful recording studio on the River Thames, and um, that sort of period where the band were like not as active as kind of I was hoping we would be because of all the personal shit that was going on. I would often go into the studio just to sort of have something to do, and so I think what was going on in my life, what the fact that the band was in a bit of a weird place, sort of 1995, I started doing things on my own because there was a lot of time when the band weren't busy. Um, so yeah, I think the inspiration for doing it on my own was just sort of boredom. As initially, like I got to do something with my day, because I can't just be waiting around for everyone else the whole time. Otherwise, I never do anything. Um, so that was why I started doing my own stuff. But I always felt like, well, I can't really sing. Well, I could sing, but I can't. I'm not Elizabeth Fraser, so I probably shouldn't bother. And that was sort of in my head initially about whether I should actually sing on the record. But in the end, I did. The first solo record we put out on Bella Union was my album. The first album that came out on Bella Union was my solo record, and I did sing on it, but not confidently or comfortably. And I think if you're in a band with a singer that amazing, it's understandable that you might think, yeah, I'm not sure it'd be good for me to, in my head, compare myself with anything close to what she's doing because she's in a different league to everyone else. So I didn't make another solo record again because I think I found the whole thing quite traumatic. So it wasn't until maybe blimey, 2016 that I started doing more music again, but it was always with someone else and with other singers because those were the things that I found like I needed the most help with.
And we're gonna get to that in a couple of minutes. But
Nice one.
oh, lovely dog, by the way.
Thanks. Just got to take her out for a walk, but carry on.
Of course. Um, but kind of with that solo career, did you make any music yourself, just maybe tinkering away, writing music or whatever? Did you do much of that prior to making this album, or was it just
No, I don't. None of us did. I mean, Cocteau Twins was everything. It was our life, man. I mean, it was like every day, full time, every day. For that period, sort of 88 when we made Bluebell Knoll, right through to, well, the moment there where I said, things were starting to get a bit weird around about 1995. I mean, we still made two more records after Heaven Las Vegas. We made Milk and Kisses and initially Four Can the Cafe and then Milk and Kisses. So we were really active, but solo stuff wasn't even on my mind at all until um, I sort of felt that the band was struggling a bit. Oh shit, sorry, did I press the wrong thing there? There we go. So yeah, I didn't really think about making music on my own until just before the band broke up. Uh, so Yeah, the cocktails was where it was all at, man. I mean, that's all I was thinking of, trying to keep the band together, trying to heal the damage that was going on. And sometimes I was successful at that, and sometimes I wasn't. Uh, but being a musician for me at that point, um,
Sorry, your camera froze. So,
oh, sorry, is that better?
yeah, could you go back to saying like when you were a musician? That's just before you cut off there.
Sure. My role as a musician at this point in the career, sort of 1990, Heaven Las Vegas, right through to when the band broke up in 1997, my head was not in solo, what am I going to do with my life as a musician? I was purely a important member of this band, and my role was to try and keep it together and to help us make as much great music as we could make. That's all I was thinking of. Obviously, I was a young parent at this time as well. We all were. Robin and Liz had a child in the late, right just before Heaven Las Vegas came, and then I had my two kids came shortly after. So it's a very important time in all our lives, not just musically, but we're going through a lot of stuff individually. They were as a couple, and me as the kind of third wheel. I was doing my best to kind of fit in and keep things sweet, but you can only do that for so long if the fundamental parts of it are a bit broken, and that's ultimately what saw the downfall of the band. Really, it's just that we weren't able to heal the bad things.
Simon, I see you're getting in the car. Are you going somewhere, or are you going to be
Yeah,
driving?
I'm fine now. I'm happy to sit in the car, so we're all good.
Oh, brilliant! Didn't want to be keeping you, but okay. So there's a couple more questions. Anyways, I'll edit this part out after the interview. But anyways, that's really really interesting then. And coming from playing with a band with Cocteau Twins and then being alone in the studio, was it difficult to play by yourself and start arranging things and writing your songs, or was it easier to kind of be able to express your creativity nearly?
Yeah, I don't know if it was easy. I think I certainly had more confidence by that point because by the time we had our own beautiful studio where we made Heaven Las Vegas, and right through to when the studio went bust, sort of 10 years later, in the first few years of Bella Union. If you're going into the studio every day, and I'm producing other bands, and the recording studio is your base. Our office was there. You're going in every day. You're working with all these different people in the studio, like engineers, and it's not a place you don't feel comfortable, and the more you do something, the better you get, as I said earlier. So I definitely felt that making music, producing music was going to be my life, and I certainly didn't have a fear about doing any of it. Maybe the solo thing is a whole different. The solo career is a whole different thing because I never actually really intended to have one, and I think if the band hadn't been going through its breakup, I would never have thought about it because my desires as a musician was never to be at the front of the stage, taking the glory. I'm the guy at the back. I'm a backroom person in many ways, as my father was. I'm the guy that prefers to stand in the back and not be recognized and no one pay any attention to. So the making music part, yeah, absolutely loved it. Being in the studio, absolutely. Being on stage, didn't mind it. Can't say that was my favorite part of being in a band. But certainly in the first 7 or 8 years, it was fun because why wouldn't it be? You've never done it before. You're traveling all around the world. You're meeting amazing people. and your fans are loving what you're doing, and the whole thing is just exciting and new. But as you get into your 30s and you have kids and you have responsibilities and your priorities change a little bit, and there was a definite conflict there for, I think all of us probably had our own issues with the band at some point. It's never going to be beautiful and plain sailing the whole way through. And even though we were making fascinating, interesting music all the way through, maybe not every single album is brilliant track to track, but I think for the most part we were still making interesting, challenging music. That was a great thing to be part of, and I'll always be grateful for that, and I'll always be very proud of all the things that we did together.
Wow. That's really, really amazing to hear though, reflecting on your career like that and kind of re-releasing solo works. What was it like returning back to some of your solo career recently to release it? Did you have to do much work on the album when releasing it, or was it perfect as it was?
I didn't do much, to be honest. I put some other tracks that I'd put out on a Japanese version of the record that hadn't been available here. I just stuck them on the end to make it a slightly longer project, a longer album. I redid the artwork, which I hadn't really liked at the time, for a number of reasons I can't be bothered to go into. But I got together with my own Bella Union art designer to come up with the new sleeve. I don't know why I did it, because it certainly wasn't like I need the limelight. I need the attention back on this record. I think it was because it was an anniversary. It was our 25th anniversary as a label. This was the very first release on the label 25 years ago. And I think I was getting pressure from the kids in the office who were like, come on, that record hasn't been available for 25 years. Because remember, when it came out, I don't think well, no, it hadn't been out on vinyl in 1997, because it was the very first release on Bella Union. The releases in 1997 were generally always were all CD. No, I don't think very few people put out vinyl in 1997. It just wasn't a thing people did. So yeah, I kind of just went with it. I went with the vibe in the office, which was, don't be such a pussy about it. It's fine. It's a thing worth commemorating. It was the first release on the record label. Just get over yourself and put it out. And I was like, okay, I guess. And that's what I ended up doing. I tried to just sort of forget about my ego and the fact that I didn't think it was that great, and just accept that other people did enjoy it, and that was fine in itself.
Fair enough. And then in 1997, you mentioned our 25-year anniversary. So going from 2022 solo works 25 years back, we're in 1997, you founded the amazing indie record label Bella Union with Robin Guthrie. Could you tell us how Bella Union began, and did you ever see it becoming the multi-artist label that it is today?
Well, it began really just as a vehicle to put out Cocteau Twins music, man. That's actually, 100% the only reason we decided to put a record label together. We hated record labels. There certainly was never an idea to even release anybody else's music. So that's something I definitely need to say before all the other stuff that happened after it. So we started the label because we had Nightmare Time on 4AD at the end, and a Nightmare Time on the major label we signed to in '93. And if we were going to make, oh shit, sorry, if we're going to make another record, well, ultimately we didn't. But if we were going to make another record, it would have to be on our own record label. So that's why we started Bella Union, to put out Cocteau Twins music and Cocteau Twins sort of related things. So solo projects like the one I talked about there. Um, if we were to do another collaboration with someone like Harold, it would just come out on our own label. We had our own beautiful studio where we could make all these records for free, and it just seemed a very natural, obvious thing to do. But then, in 1997, a few months after we started the label, Elizabeth decided that she really just was finding it really very difficult to be in the band. And she announced that she was leaving. So, in a way, that was the sort of start of everything kind of falling apart. The start of the studio kind of ending up going bust. Eventually, not having the band anymore was really the ruination of the studio. But probably it was the catalyst for me being able to kind of throw my weight into running a record label, right? So I'm like, okay, I've got no band anymore. What am I going to do with my day? What am I going to do with all these people that work here? We've got to try and keep this thing going. So we just started putting records out without any idea what we were doing, without any idea at all about how to do it, um, how to distribute a record, how to press them up. We just winged the whole thing. And we got it horribly wrong many, 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 many times. And for the first few years, it was really difficult, and I don't think we just didn't know what we were doing. It was kind of fun and exciting, but at the same time, no idea whether we'll be able to make a fist of this. Obviously, having the recording studio was massive because it meant that we could, like with the Czars, John Grant's band, and with Dirty Three, for example, we could bring bands in and allow them to use this beautiful recording studio with the engineers that we employed and make their records ultimately sort of for free. Um, and that was a massive thing because it was sort of like it started this idea of Bella Union being, a lot more than just like a label that puts shit out. It felt like sort of a home. It felt like a place that we could really develop the craft of putting records out. So I think that's where we started the vibe. And once the studio went bust a couple of years later, then it was okay. Shit's getting real here, and well, I had to because Robin had moved away at this point and wasn't involved in the label anymore. It became very much a kind of like, okay, Simon, you got to do this on your own, man, and you got to throw everything in, and you've got to learn very quickly, and that's what happened. And lots of mistakes were made, but things slowly started coming together, and we started putting out some pretty cool records. And I think over the last 28 years, we've probably put out a decent amount. I'm pretty happy with what we've done.
And 20 years after 1997, you put out one of those records, Ojala, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, um, the debut album with Lost Horizons. And I read that Lost Horizons started with you and Richie Thomas starting the group. Um, could you tell us a little bit more about how the group started?
Yeah, I think we were getting to the 20th anniversary of the label, 1990, 2017. You said yes, and I was starting to think, my God, I haven't made music for so long. I've just been so consumed with all these other artists' careers, helping them get their shit off the ground and helping them develop and helping them make their records. And please don't get me wrong, I thoroughly enjoyed every second of it. But I definitely was feeling like this anniversary, I should be really like happy, that we managed to get to 20 years. But I wasn't feeling happy about it. Something was missing. When I realized what it was that I'm a musician and I haven't made music for so long. I definitely felt a lack of self fulfillment, I suppose, on a creative level. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
once I kind of thought about, well, what do you want to do about that? And I thought, well, who do I want to play with? I don't really want to be in a band. That's actually the last thing I want to do because I don't need anyone else's input into writing and recording. I know exactly what I want to do, but I can't do it completely on my own because I just don't have that capability, or to be quite frank, the time. So talking to Richie, I rang him up, and he was somebody that I used to we used to take on tour with us. He was the drummer of the band Diff Juzz, who were an instrumental band on 4AD for a couple of albums. They were a phenomenal band that never really took off. They never really got the credit that they should have, but they were a huge part of the '80s for me. And watching Richie Thomas play drums was one of the great moments in my life when standing on the side of the stage watching him play every night on that tour that we did in 1984 where we took them out as our support. I'll never forget those days. And I thought, it'd be nice to see Richie again. Let's get together. I'll see what he's doing. And we hooked up. We had a lovely, good reminisce. And I said, "Do you fancy doing something? Just getting in a rehearsal room and just pissing around and mucking about and seeing if not even with a record in mind, not even anything like that. Just for the fun of it, man. Just like we were 15 again, like just get in a room and just make music because I really need that. I need just to make some music and not, I don't want to think about it being a thing or a band or anything. I just want to make music. And that's how we approached it. Um, and yet within a couple of weeks of doing exactly that, we were like recording all these jams in this rehearsal room in Hackney. And then I was taking the hard drive back home, and I was living not far from here, actually, in Brighton, in this tiny little um, first floor flat. My wife had, my soon to be wife hadn't. Oh no, my wife had just literally moved over from America. We'd got married, and she moved over, and we were living in this tiny little flat. And I was upstairs with my headphones on, listening back to this hard drive, listening to all these pieces. And I didn't really know what they were. They weren't songs. They were just bits. And I was like, oh, you know what? I'm going to send this one to this singer. I'm just going to edit it a little bit and do a couple more things, do some overdubs, add some guitars here. And very, very slowly over the next 6 months, I started kind of putting these bits into shape and turning them into kind of pieces of music with a structure. And then once they had the structure, I would then send them to a singer who I felt might get it. Um, and that's how Lost Horizon started. And probably the first album should have just been a single, and probably the second album should have just been a single. But I think at that point, because I'm older and I've missed making music so much, I wasn't quite able to self edit, and I just ended up putting out all the songs that we recorded on both records. So probably should have just done 10 songs on each record because I think double records is just too much for most people to cope with these days. It's hard enough listening to 10 minutes of a record by these days for journalists and radio presenters. They haven't got time to sit through an hour and 10 minutes of a band they've never heard of before. But I've realized that's probably why, the records didn't sort of get the attention they probably deserved. But for me, I didn't really care about that anyway. I was just so excited just to be making music again with my friend. And that was really the catalyst for doing album number two. Although I guess because of COVID, and lockdown, that album was made in a very, very different way. I just sort of made the whole thing in my garden shed. um Richie would do some things in his garden shed, and we'd sort of swap them because we couldn't really see each other because of whatever was going on with the world. And the whole record was sort of made just by sending things to different people, and then I'd finish them at home and send them to this singer or that singer, and then they'd record their bit at home and send it back to me, and then I'd mix the whole thing at home, and then the record would come out. It was
Yeah.
really great fun to do, but I can't honestly say it was a very sort of sociable way of making a record because I don't think I ever saw anybody. And we never played a show. We played some shows on the first record, not many, but a few. We played Green Man Festival. We did a UK tour, and we played End of the Road, and we had some fun with it. Second album came out. I didn't really have the chance to tour it because if you can think that there's maybe, I don't know, 18 songs on a Lost Horizon record with a different singer on every single song, that's very hard. That's almost impossible to recreate live unless you're using one or two singers to cover all 18 songs, which is kind of what I did on the first record, but I didn't want to do that on the second. So on the second, we were supposed to have a show, I think, at Queen Elizabeth Hall in London. But then I can't remember what happened. I think COVID came back and it got scrapped. And then by the time I wanted to rearrange it again, I think all the other musicians were back working and touring and releasing records of their own. So I wasn't able to get them to come and play my show. So I just, nah, we'd just move on and do something else. And then I started writing my book. So whether I'm ever make another Lost Horizons record is debatable. Maybe I will. I'm not. I haven't got one foot in the grave just yet, but at the same time, the book has taken it. It took a couple of years to get that done, and I've enjoyed the promotion of it over the last few months. And the paperback is about to come out, I think, in May. So I'll probably be doing some. I'll probably be doing some more promotion for it in the coming months.
Fair enough, and that's going to be very exciting because with the paperback now out, it'll be a ton more people getting to know the incredible book, which we're going to be discussing in a sec. But with the debut album of Jala, that means hopefully, I wish, or if only. What inspired the name? Where did you discover it?
Oh, Harlow. Well, that's actually Richie came up with that name. It's Spanish for God willing. Yeah, I thought it was a really cool name, and it just sort of summed up. Hold on a sec, Sonny, be quiet. Sorry. Uh,
It's
yeah, it
fine.
was just a beautiful title, and it sort of summed up the thing we were all going through at that point in time. And I think thinking up a title is always a hard thing to do. But the same with the second one. I think In Quiet Moments summed up the second record so beautifully because of how the record was made in sort of solitude in the studio at a time where no one was doing anything, no one was going out. Um, so those two titles actually, because with certainly Cocteau Twins for sure, titles were the thing that came right 5 minutes before we had to deliver everything. You know what I mean? It's like, Liz, we've got to send the titles in, and she'd be like driving herself crazy to get the album title done in time. Song titles as well, to be honest. So, that's quite normal for bands just to leave everything right to the last minute. But thankfully for Lost Horizons, we had them early on.
That's really, really cool. And where you mentioned there, briefly you mentioned it was great to be making music again, but kind of for the first album specifically, what was it like in the studio? What was the feeling that you were get kind of making music and performing it again? How did you really feel in the studio?
I felt like a little kid. I mean, I felt like yeah, like I just won the lottery. I mean, just shaking my head in disbelief while I was playing music with Richie live in a room with him playing the drums and me on the piano or the bass or the guitar or whatever it was. Because that's how we did it. We basically went in the studio with a friend of ours who's an engineer, and we had a grand piano and a drum kit, and then I had my guitar and my bass, and we had so we did it like we like Cocteau Twins did. So we basically just jammed stuff. We started from nothing, came up with a part on the piano, and then Richie would start playing along with me, and we just recorded it that way. So it was all live, and it was all totally kind of ramshackle. Um, and when I eventually took the stuff back home on the hard drive in the flat, like I said earlier, I didn't imagine for a second that these recordings would be the ones that ended up on the record, because they were so rough and ready. They were just like literally a couple of mics, and it was all improvised. So any mistakes never got fixed because it was just a sort of one-off live recording. But what I found when I got home, and I sort of thought, oh, that's a kind of cool piano piece. I'm going to stick a bass on there. So I would put a bass on top at home in Brighton in the flat. Um, And I was like, oh, that's kind of gels the whole thing together. And I've got this is the piano parts thinking, my gosh, there's so many mistakes in there. I need to fix
Mm.
that. But then I ended up never fixing them because by the time I added layers of guitars and all that stuff, you really didn't hear the mistakes anymore. And even if you did, it sort of almost added to its I don't know, just the character of the record. It's like it didn't have to be perfect. So I actually really enjoyed that. And being in the room with Richie for the wasn't even that long. We maybe only did like 20 days of rehearsals, of recordings, just sort of few hours every day in the Hackney studio that we had. And then and then it was more a case of just sort of bringing it back home and trying to shape it into something. But the actual original days in the studio, where it was just him and me, um, w- yeah, it did feel a bit like being a teenager, experiencing playing with your mates for the very first time and just getting all excited about things, and then going home thinking about them all night long and waking up in the morning thinking, oh, can't wait to get back to the studio. And I haven't had that feeling for so long. I mean, I don't need to have it again anymore right now. It's not like I have to do that again because whenever you do something for those reasons, it's never the same. If you I don't know what's the word is, hankering after something that you think is going to replace something in your life that's missing. When you do it, if it's the second or the third or the fourth time you're doing it, it's never going to be the same as the first time you did it. And certainly with Lost Horizon's second album, it was not as exciting as the first record. But in a way, I'm much, much happier with the second record because I think it's a better record and it's a better production. And I think the songs are stronger, the performances are better, the guests are better because I know better now what I want to do with Lost Horizons. I think the first record wasn't even meant to be a record, it was just us pissing around in the studio, just having fun. Wasn't even meant to be an album. So I think there's a distinction between the two periods and the two records, and I certainly learned very much a lot from the first one. Um, but I still don't know if a third one is possible, or if I even want to make a third one. I want to make more music, but I'm not sure I want to do another Lost Horizons record because it's so difficult to put together. Because if you think about it, so let's even if I did a single 10-track album, I finish one song and then I send it to a singer. Let's say John Grant, okay, who was on the second record. Send him the song. He listened to it. So, oh, I'd love to do something. Okay, great. When can you do it? Well, I'm going off on tour then, and then I've got to make my own album, and then so it might be free in about 4 months' time. So now I've got to wait 4 months for him to even think about starting his song. So it might be 5 months or 6 months by the time he has. Well, times that by 10, and then it's going to take you, it does take such a long time to make these records because you're always reliant on other people and the singer to come back with their track. They've got to write the lyric, they've got to get in the studio, they've got to send it back and say, what do you think? And then I've got to give them my opinions and backwards and forwards because you're not in the studio together at the same time. So it's not spontaneous and it's not easy to fix quickly. So it is kind of a ball ache to do a Lost Horizons record. I mean, it definitely was great during lockdown because what the fuck else was there to do? It was the perfect thing for me to do, and probably the reason I spent so much time on it, and the mixing. I took so long doing the mixing, and I've never mixed a record like that before. I don't know if I would. Well, I don't know if I could do it again now. Certainly, the time I have is much more limited than it was during COVID, where, as I say, you couldn't go out. So it was a perfect time to make that record.
Fair enough. And moving on from Lost Horizons, I'd love to move on to a project that you didn't actually make any of the music on it, which is you made a collection of tracks Paradise, The Sound of Ivor Raymond by your dad, Ivor Raymond. How did you find revisiting your father's catalogue for a new collection?
Yeah, it's a huge thing for me to have done. Not really just to throw a light on the incredible music he left behind, but really as a way of trying to understand. I mean, I didn't do it for this reason. I didn't do it because I wanted to understand him better, but in doing it, that is actually what's happened. And I've realized the parallels and writing the book, of course, writing the book and looking back into his life. There's a whole chapter, or well, several chapters in a way. There's a whole part of the book that's completely dedicated to his life prior to making music, just his life growing up, and of course his music career. And it's a huge part of the book for me because I think writing it made me realize that the things I'd thought about him and me were quite different. The reality was quite different. I sort of thought, well, I'm no, a completely different kind of person to him, completely different kind of musician. I couldn't even, shine the shoes that he wears. I'm not even close to that. He did this, he did that. He was an arranger. He was this. He was a curator. And then I sort of did the book and put the records together, and I thought, well, it isn't the same, and I do still hold him up very high. But I also realise there are an awful lot of things about us that are similar, and that there are a lot of parallels. Obviously, he worked with Scott Walker, and Scott Walker has obviously been a huge part of my life. You'll come to that part in the book soon enough, but it's a very, very important part for me because Scott Walker's always been an absolute hero of mine. obviously my dad worked with the Walker Brothers on the early productions, and those records are, yeah, they're classics, right? Sonic and Shine Anymore, Make It Easier on Yourself. Those are classic pop records, which I heard in the house growing up, and you know, very, very important part of my musical upbringing. So then see the parallels between what he did as a musician and arranger and what I've ended up then doing working with Scott Walker myself on the BBC Prom that came out in 2017, and working with his family on different things. It's really, really beautiful to see those connections, and for me to kind of work it all out through the process of putting these compilation albums of his work together. I didn't know that would happen when I started doing it. I just wanted to throw a light on his work because I was discovering it much later in life. I didn't know all this stuff. As a kid, I only knew the same stuff that everyone knew. Oh, he wrote "I Only Want to Be With You." Wow, that's a massive song. Oh, he worked with Bowie. I knew the headlines. I knew this and that and bits and pieces. But it was only when I was getting into my 30s, I was like, oh, wow, he did so much cool stuff. And researching the book and looking back into his career for these compilation albums that we put out. There's two of them, well, Paradise, the first one, and Odyssey, the second one. I mean, there's two double records there, which sort of, I think, very succinctly show all the different colors to his palette, all the different things he was able to do, not just as a musician, but as a singer, as a pianist, as an arranger, as an orchestrator, as a producer, so many different things. And I'm like, wow, this guy's pretty amazing. So it was a really beautiful project to be involved with. The artwork I think is exceptional. The front cover is a really beautiful picture that I have of my father. The second album is a really beautiful picture I had of my mother, who's sadly passed away just before we were able to release that record. Um, so yeah, two very important records, perhaps two of the most important records on Bella Union in a way, for me anyway, certainly personally. I love everything we put out naturally, but I think I'm so lucky that no one else would have put those records out. That's what I probably should say. No one was calling up, going, "Oh, can we put out an Ivor Raymonde record?" Because he was a backroom guy. He was the guy that nobody really cared about. People don't care about those guys anymore. They only care about the guy at the front of the stage, or the girl at the front of the stage, or who wrote the song. And the people that do all the stuff in the background, the string arrangements and the orchestrations, and those people aren't interesting. They are interesting to me, but they're not interesting to most people. Um, and I think having your own label it enables you to be sort of, what's the word? Well, selfish. It's probably one way of putting it. I was able to go, well, I've got my own bloody record label. I can do what I want if I want to put these records out. If no one buys them, I don't care. Um, so yes, I do feel very proud of those releases, and I'm glad you picked up on it.
Oh, no problem. I really wanted to discuss them. And you mentioned there your autobiography. And last year you released your autobiography in one of your Cocteau Twins, Ivor Raymond and Me. What inspired you to write the book?
Well, you know what I'd said originally. Nah, I'm not doing a book. Musicians' biographies are often quite dull and just sort of full of stories of drugs and you know uh, awful relationships, and I just thought I don't want to go there. It's just the band is very personal it's a very personal band to a lot of people, and people love it very much. And I wanted to be sure that if I ever did do anything, it would for all the right reasons. And I certainly didn't want to trash the band by writing some kind of kiss and tell story, because that's there isn't really a kiss and tell story in there apart from all the drug issues. But then there's drug issues in every band, isn't there? Um, yeah, I didn't want to do that kind of book because it's not me. That's not who I am as a person. I could have, but I chose not to do that because it just wouldn't have been authentic. Um, So I decided not to do a book. I was asked about it a few times in my 50s. Oh, Cox says you should definitely do a book. Because I write. I do have articles published in magazines and stuff over the years. So I am a fan of writing. Um, so it's always something in the back of my mind that maybe I could, but I have to have something to write about. and I didn't think I did. I didn't think my life was interesting enough to write a book about it, which is stupid. Now I know that because it is very interesting. Now I read it back, I'm like, oh, actually is quite interesting. But when you're doing work and you're running from A to B, signing this band and that band, you're too busy to be sitting around, with your feet up, thinking, oh, back in the day, I did this and I met them, and that's just not my vibe at all, right? So I didn't think about writing a book until I met Warren Ellis. Okay, so Warren Ellis from Nick Cave's band. I met up with Warren in Brighton, and he had just had his own book, Nina Simone's Gum, uh, released, and I was talking to him about the book and how he'd come together, and he sort of said, "I'd never intended to write a book. I think musicians' books are boring." I was like, "So do I. That's exactly what I think." So I kind of was listening very intently to what he said and about how his journey had sort of led him to write the book, and I found the whole thing very fascinating and quite inspiring. So I sort of went back home and rethought it and thought, well, look, Warren's done this brilliant book out of nowhere. He'd never intended to write a book. He didn't think he could write. Maybe I should try. So I wrote a few chapters and I sent them off to a literary editor because I was told that you had to have a literary editor. I didn't even know what one was, like an agent, a literary agent. Sorry, not an editor, a literary agent. So I found a couple, and I found one that had heard of me and liked the band, which was lucky. And I sent him some bits, and he was like, "Oh, this is fantastic. You should definitely do more." So that was the beginning of the journey. Obviously, I learned a lot along the way. I mean, I actually thought I'd finished the book at a point much earlier than I did finish. I think I'd written 30,000 words, and I thought, yeah, I think that's it. That's the whole story done. And I sent it off, and he was like, "This is really great. So, when do you think you'll have the rest of it done?" And I was like, what do you mean?" He went, "Well, this is 30,000 words. You need to write 100,000 words for a book." I was like, 100,000, right? Okay, so I've only written a third of the book. Shit. So I basically kind of took a bit of stock there. I went away for a few weeks and took my iPad with me and just sort of sat at a table for 3 weeks. No, for longer than that. Like actually, for 6 months, I basically wrote the book non-stop. And initially, I went away on holiday and got a large percentage of it done. Then came back and went off to a cafe in Brighton every day, every morning from 8 till 2, just pottering away, writing stuff, going through my memories, and and then just it just happened. And then by the end, I wrote too much. I wrote 130,000 words. When I actually stopped and I did a word count, I was like, bloody hell. So I told the agent, I said, I've actually got 130,000 words. He went, well, that's too many. You're going to have to lose a third of the book. So I went from having a third of a book to having, you know, uh,
One and a third of a book.
yes, one and a third book. Um, and actually that was difficult for me because when the publisher, who was also the editor, got his hands on it, and he was like, "Oh, this is brilliant, but you're going to have to lose. You have to lose about 30,000 words." And I was like, "Ah." So he went through it and edited the bits that he felt were, you know, could be lost. And a lot of good stuff was lost, and I understand why. And listen, he's the editor, he's the publisher, he knows what he's talking about. I don't know the first thing about it, so I went with it. I thought a couple of things, but we lost a lot of the Bella Union stuff. There isn't much Bella Union story in there, um, and I get that. Probably that's the least interesting to a Cocteau Twins fan or a fan of the Ivor Raymonde years. I'm sure there's room for a book in the future, maybe about it. Um, but I think I've got enough in there. There's the Fleet Foxes story in there. There's the John Grant story, Father John Misty stuff. So, yeah, I think there's enough in there to keep the hardcore fans of the label happy. But I definitely could have gone into a lot. Well, I did go into a lot more detail with the Bella Union thing that got edited out. But that's the world that we live in. When you have a publisher, they're entitled to say what they think shouldn't be in there, and yeah. as I say, I'm not expert enough in writing to contradict them, you know.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And then sitting down during those 6 months, kind of, was it difficult to write, or did it all come naturally?
Oh no, it was the easiest thing in the world. I really, really loved it. I loved, yeah, I loved looking back and going through it. It took me a while to kind of like find the thread of the story and how to actually tell it without it just being like, well, then I did this, and then I did that, and then I met them, and then I did this. Because that's easy, you know, you could just basically go back through all your, you know, your calendar and go back in your brain and just go, well, okay, so I can look at all the releases that we made, and you could just do a chronological um, thing. And of course, there has to be some chronology in a book, or else it's just going to be flitting backward and forward, and no one will understand where the hell they are. So you know, there is a thread, and I'd like to think it makes some sense. But, you know, instead of starting at the beginning, the book actually starts, you know, with an event that happens to me. I won't tell your listeners and viewers what that event was in case they do want to go purchase the book or listen to it. But, you know, a specific event happens that starts the book off, and it is a significant event in my life that's very important. But it enables me to sort of go back and forth in time a little bit. The Ivor Raymond story was difficult not to tell because a lot of that stuff was from audio tapes that my mum had left that she recorded with my father before he died in 1990. So a lot of that stuff was easy because it was more a case of what to leave out because there was a lot of stuff in my dad's story that probably wouldn't be of interest to a great number of readers. You know, sort of a lot of factual information that we didn't need to get into about records and stuff like that. Probably interesting in a sort of in the grand scheme of things to somebody that was very anal about the 60s, but in terms of sort of telling my story, that section of the book needed to make sense, you know, with me as the storyteller. Um, so that bit was difficult because I could have started that with that. In fact, I thought it should start the book, but Pete, the beautiful publisher and editor of the book, you know, he felt very strongly that it shouldn't. Mostly because anyone coming to a Simon Raymonde book as a Cocteau Twins fan isn't going to want to sit through, you know, 60 pages before they get to that stuff. So I was like, no, no, you're right. I get that. So we had to sort of, we spent a long time working out where it should go, and he was brilliant in that. We did try different things, and you know, stuff that only a publisher and someone that's experienced in editing and moving things around and arranging a book goes. Because you know, I have literally no experience of that at all. I've got some friends who write, but you know, I think you really have to have someone on your side who's like I can see where this should go. It should be here. It's a really important part of the book, but it needs to be here. And then we'd talk about it, and then he'd explain to me why, and I'd be like, "Yes, you're absolutely right." So we'd move it there, and then we'd read it, and it would be like, "You know what? That flows absolutely brilliantly." So things like that, he definitely helped me with. I mean, in terms of the words on the paper, I mean, they are all mine, and I did really love getting the story down and trying to have some humor in there as well, but being really honest and authentic and telling the story exactly as it happened. I think the book is quite conversational. My writing style is quite conversational because I it's almost like you're listening to me talk now in the way that I write the book, sort of.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
And maybe if those of the viewers that tune in want to get a taste of it, the audiobook is probably a good place to start because my voice is hopefully now relatively familiar, and you know the story will then probably resonate a little bit. Sometimes words on a dry piece of paper, you know, can take a little while to get into the swing of it. What is this guy? Well, who is this guy? What kind of vibe is he? Um, but when you actually hear someone talking, that it's a bit more obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is because I'm listening to the audiobook at the moment. I'm part of the way through it and I'm enjoying it. And if you want to purchase the audiobook or the actual book, links will be down in the description of this episode. And finally, before we finish up, Simon, I would love to ask you, is there anything new coming up for either you or Bella Union?
Well, there's always something new coming up on Bella Union, that's for sure. Because that is the nature of record labels. I think it is a very interesting time in the music business. If I was brutally honest, I'd say it's the most difficult period that the British music industry, anyway, I can't speak for the rest of the world, is going through. I think clubs are suffering, promoters are suffering, audience is suffering. Uh, the record buying public is definitely suffering. The record shops are suffering, and the record labels and the artists are all suffering. There are so many reasons why, and this podcast would have to be 10 hours long for us even to get close to scratching the surface of why that is. But a lot of it you can put down to a number of obvious things. Brexit, the price of stuff, the price of vinyl, the lack of investment in the arts in our world, the fees that artists get paid, the cost of everything. If you just sort of look at it on just a list of top 10 things that are wrong, you'd have to wonder how is this industry going to survive? And that's a whole nother podcast, isn't it? Like, what's up with the record industry, guys? Well, I can tell you 1,000 things that are up with it that are not great. So, of course, on a daily basis, keeping the record label going, working out how to make it work for not just me, for my staff, but for the bands, how to make living, how to make a living. Because I manage a lot of bands as well with my wife. We manage about 15 bands together, as well as running the record label. So that in itself indicates how our desperation is to help people who are really struggling right now, because actually quite easy to put a record out. Running the record label is not easy, because the numbers don't add up often with labels. Because you spend 10 grand on an advance for a band. Just as a hypothetical, you give a band 10 grand, the record costs you maybe 5 to 10 grand to put out and do press and radio. So you spent 20 grand. The record hasn't even come out yet. The record comes out, nobody buys it, which is quite common. Or maybe 1,000 people buy it, or 500. So you make back a couple of grand of your 20. Well, you're 18 grand out of pocket now. Now, okay, so you do that 10 times. You're 180 grand out of pocket. Well, that's unsustainable, correct?
Yeah.
Unless
Yeah.
unless I was a zillionaire who didn't care about losses each year. You've got to get it right more than you get it wrong, and that becomes increasingly difficult when the industry itself is kind of so screwed. And even the top artists that you would think are selling incredibly well are only maybe selling a couple of thousand, three or 4,000 records. Well, if the best artists are only selling 3 or 4 thousand records, there's very little hope for any new band to break through. And of course, there'll be exceptions. Your last dinner parties, your idols, your English teachers. There'll always be one or two that manage to break through and get all the attention and do well, and everyone goes, "Oh, the industry's so great, it's very thriving." No, it isn't. It's not thriving at all. The few that are doing well are doing great, and good luck to them is what I say. But everyone else is really struggling, and especially new artists that don't have any help. And so as a manager, our job is not just to look at putting the record out. Is how can we help with other things? Finding you a booking agent, finding you a publishing deal, finding you the right promoter, helping you with this, helping you with your socials, So the whole like crew of people that we have working for us to help develop artists more than just let's put a record out, because putting a record out is just a tiny fraction of the game. And then you could argue that it's not even really that important at all. The most important thing is getting out on the road and being an incredible live band so that you can make money from performing, because that's the bread and butter right there. The record itself, well, some may do well, some may stream incredibly well, others may not. It's very volatile. It's very hard to draw a picture and say, well, this is going to work. Does radio help sell your records anymore? No, not really. Does a great does a great press review in Pitchfork help? No. None of these things in isolation make any difference anymore. Once upon a time, they did. Go on Jules Holland and play on live TV. Oh, surely that helps. No, it doesn't. It's very depressing when you look at it like that. So Am I busy? Yes, I'm incredibly busy, but I'm trying to save the world in my own tiny little world. So that keeps me incredibly busy, and I don't have time to sort of really enjoy my own life, or sort of think much about my own personal creativity right now, because I'm too busy trying to keep the whole thing afloat, and giving our bands a crack at their own survival.
Fair enough, and I think that's a great incentive to buy some vinyl on Bella Union's website.
Yes, do
Obviously, the
it.
links will all be down below. Please support them and all the great artists on their label. But that's all for now with our conversation together, Simon. And I really appreciate you coming on here and
Oh,
having this chat with me. So thank you so much for that. And it's been great to speak to you. So thank you so much.
oh, thanks, Logan. Talk to you again soon.
Talk to you soon, Simon. Goodbye.
Thanks, man.